This time, I want to talk about how the world really works. I did a podcast not too long ago talking about geopolitics and all that, but I suppose for a lot of listeners that's still very foreign. I also did an article highlighting elements of Stephen Dorrell's book on Her Majesty's Secret Service, the book on MI6, which is a really big, inaccessible tome, I think, for pretty much everyone except for nerds like me. But, really understanding how the world works, it's really a question of how far you want to go with it. And the degree to which you want to go down the rabbit hole is really going to determine, how far you can, how far you want to go with it is really going to determine, or I should say be determined, I guess, by the level of truth you're willing to accept. So a lot of times when we're confronted with truth that makes us uncomfortable, it makes us question our presuppositions, we question our foundational worldviews and beliefs in those worldviews. So naturally, we have an aversion to that as humans. We don't really want to accept the possibility that we've been in error, that we believe something wrong. And so what we do is it's human nature, in the sense of fallen human nature. It's our nature to ignore those things. And unfortunately, we choose often to live in the simulation or the false reality that we've constructed. So while movies like The Matrix and things like that are on one level kind of cheesy because they're something that's entered into the pop culture group mind, group think, on another level, it's somewhat profound, because to have one's eyes opened to the workings of the world, how it really works, is a very shocking process. It is analogous in a certain way to, the religious idea of being born again or changed, because essentially that involves a shaking up of one's social ordering, one's upbringing, one's understanding of oneself, if you will. So, in other words, we've all grown up with a certain view of the world. A lot of psychologists, like Piaget, will write about infant psychology, and what we can gather from that is that, as we progress from youth to adolescence to adulthood, we've basically been given a system of beliefs, and that system of beliefs is based around certain archetypes and certain myths, if you will, that our parents, our culture, our society has given us, right? So we are naturally tribal. We care for those around us. We care about our what we believe is a nation state. And all of this is sort of imprinted upon us. The religion that we were raised with, generally speaking, religions include these, archetypal ideas, the masculine, the feminine. And so these, of course, inform our whole approach to the world, to other human beings, what our purpose is, so forth and so on. And even if you're not cognizant of being given or programmed a certain view of the world, you still are, right? And I don't necessarily mean that also that being programmed or given a worldview is something that's necessarily nefarious or evil, right? I mean, just because we've grown up with something or believe something since our youth really doesn't have anything to do with whether it's objectively true or false. We could believe something that's true that our parents taught us, and we could also believe something that's false that we were taught. But really, that essentially has nothing to do with whether or not the belief or the proposition under discussion is true or false. If we were taught that 2 + 2 is 4, then well, that's something that's true regardless of whether our parents taught us that or whether we learned that in a public school or whatever, right? So essentially what I'm getting at is just that we all are given a certain set of beliefs, and this is just part of the process of maturing from youth to adolescence to adulthood. And most human beings don't question the paradigm that they've been given. They grow up with a certain paradigm that is very useful from a utilitarian perspective, right? So if you want to sort of climb the social ladder in your small town, and everyone in that town has a certain set of beliefs, Southern Baptist, whatever, it's very pragmatic, it's very useful to not question that, to go along with it, to social climb, right? I'm gonna light my cigarette. But at the same time, it's important to realize that it's not so much that belief systems are necessarily a constraint or something that enslaves us. That's sort of the radical leftist Marxist approach to any kind of, quote, traditional belief because of the Marxist assumptions of things. So that's not true. But in another sense, it's potentially the case that a belief system could be something that enslaves us or constrains us, right? And so really it has to do with what belief system matches up to reality, which one's authentically the case. Again, regardless of whether we were taught that as we were growing up. But as it turns out, most people don't want to do that because from their vantage point, because of the belief system that they have, it's not in their best interest to question the system that they've been given. So most humans are going to operate from the perspective of what's advantageous or pragmatic in the immediate situation. But it's also possible to take the red pill, right? So from the Matrix, you have the blue pill and the red pill, and Neo chooses to take the red pill, which wakes him up out of the Matrix. And of course, that's an analogy or an allegory for what we're talking about. And so I think that for teens and people that are young, there's a natural desire as they go through that period of puberty or whatever to be rebellious, to try to carve out their own identity and all that. And so that energy, generally speaking, is focused or funneled like a lightning rod, if you will, into an already established paradigm that is controlled already, right? So essentially what I'm getting at is that it's important to understand that many of the routes that people take, let's say when you're 16, 17, you begin to question the system. You decide that, public school is a joke and your teachers are fake or, whatever the typical teen angst problems are. And, your preacher is silly and all this stuff. So you decide, well, then liberalism must be true. It must be the case then that this conservative, quote unquote, stricture that's been placed upon me is what has held me down and enslaved me. And so naturally there's a pen or a corral for which that's already pre-established for you to go into. But I am a bearer of more bad news, because that pen or corral that's already been established for you is also fake. Because people at the top, people who are social engineers, psychological warfare experts, international corporate heads, these are very smart people. They're not stupid. Revolutionary movements are very old. They're not something new. They've been around for centuries. And particularly revolutionary movements in the modern world are something that have been scientifically perfected, if you will. So the impetus for revolution is something that has been scientifically engineered to be used as a tool. And these military experts, these psyops experts, are essentially masters. They get PhDs, master's degrees, if you will, in what's called the black arts. And the black arts are simply the manipulation of propaganda, warfare, military tactics, espionage, so forth, so on. And because the world is dominated by symbols, or what we call semiotics, those who can master symbols and semiotics are those who can master and marshal large groups of the populace. So this was discovered through advertising, and if you look at entities like the Rockefeller Foundation, who put a lot of money into researching mass movements, psychological warfare techniques, social engineering, etc., at places like Stanford Research, University of Chicago, London School of Economics, all these different preeminent, Yale, Harvard, these preeminent old American and British schools have put a lot of time and effort into researching the human psyche. And not just the human psyche, but essentially sociology, if you will, that was a discipline invented largely at the University of Chicago for the purpose of control. So what I'm getting at essentially is that when you're an international player at the top, it's not so much about a given ideology. So it's not about whether you are a faithful Republican, whether you are a faithful adherent to what you perceive to be liberalism, whether you're a faithful, communist or socialist. Essentially, all of these isms are tools. And so from this perspective, religion is also viewed this way. It's all viewed as a means to an end. So what is the end that these things are moving toward? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But it's important to understand that this is essentially universal. The things that we've talked about so far are universal. Everyone exists in some given social order whereby they are programmed, if you will, with some sort of view. And when I say programmed, that really doesn't mean that I'm saying that the belief systems that they're given are true or false. It's entirely possible that it's true. It's also entirely possible that what you were given growing up is false. So, with two different possibilities there, it's incumbent upon a person who would like to know what's true to recognize, obviously, that simply being given the worldview doesn't prove it, right? That you grew up with something doesn't mean it's true. And that's really the first step that people take when they want to have a better sense of what's going on in the world, why we're here, what's our purpose, all these questions. When they want to take the red pill, if you will. But so understanding the modern world, it's incumbent to understand that what's happened in Western civilization, Western culture, our society, is that we're the product of a series of revolutions. And these revolutions were a progressive sort of snowballing of questioning. Now, that might sound counterintuitive or contradictory to what I was saying earlier, because I'm essentially saying, right, that if you question things, you're going to be better off in the long run. Because I wanted to do this talk for all those people who are still so critical and still opposing me or the things that I talk about, or who still have a problem with all this stuff, who just can't accept it. I'm trying to give an explanation, and I'm already way past the point where I think that giving an explanation is actually going to do anything, because debating with someone, engaging with someone, already assumes that the person that you're engaging with and talking to has the same sort of commitments to what's true, to logic, to reason. And with most people, that's just simply not the case. Most people are not going to be logical. They're not going to be reasonable, and they don't care what's true. They care essentially what's advantageous to them in the immediate, and generally speaking, in some hedonistic sense. And you're never going to convince or change someone like that, because people like that, well, it's essentially inborn in them, right? It's being bred a certain way. So, and being born with a certain set of DNA. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't change their mind or can't, to certain degrees, choose to progress in a certain way. They can. But potential is something that's not unlimited. I mean, everybody has a limited set of potential, right? I mean, for one, we only have a certain amount of time in this life anyway. So the idea that, of unlimited human potential, that we're all capable of doing great things, and of course none of that's true, because we are all limited by so many factors. But it is still, at least potentially, the case that human potential can make certain strides, right? I mean, it just depends. It all depends upon the person and their setting and their situation. But for the purposes of looking at how the world really works, and social engineering and all these things, it's just, well, let's just put it this way. Most of what you're told, especially by the what we would call the establishment or the system, the given structure of power that is now, most of it is not true. It's a bunch of lies. Now, that sounds radical, it sounds extreme, because most people think, well, if it's all based on a bunch of lies, it wouldn't last very long. It would collapse very quick. Right. Well, it's not that every single thing that we're told, say, in mainstream media or in public school or what, it's not like every single thing is a lie. It's more so that it's twisted or it's spun. So, for example, Darwinism, right? There are a lot of scientists who adhere to Darwinism, who have made discoveries in this or that field. And so all the schools teach Darwinism. And so the rationale being, well, everyone adheres to this view. This is the scientific view. We live in a scientific world. Therefore, this is the only possible avenue. That's what's correct. And anyone who doesn't adhere to that is de facto backwards fundamentalist, some some crazy sectarian. But if we come at this from the right perspective that I'm trying to get those who are able to, go this far down the rabbit hole to see, it's not really, none of that follows, right? None of that is consistent with the fact that just because something is the dominant view, that it must be correct, right? So it's not any different than, if you were brought up in some, say, fringe, crazy cult. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that the cult is false, right? Its belief systems are not true, right? Just as much as it's not demonstrably true simply because you were raised with that. In the same way, simply because Darwinism is the dominant view, it doesn't follow from that it's true. Because that's not how belief systems or worldviews operate. Why am I saying that? Because think about it. What I just said about all of us being given a worldview as we are progressing and growing in our own individual lives is true for everybody, right? So that's true for Richard Dawkins. It's true for it was true for Charles Darwin. They were raised in a certain climate, in a certain atmosphere, in a certain zeitgeist that gave them a certain view of the world. So what I'm trying to get across is that most people believe simply what everyone else believes. And that has absolutely nothing to do with what's true or false. And once you begin to think from that perspective, you begin to realize that the world could actually be a lot different than the way most people perceive it to be. Let me give an example. Patriotism is something that is sort of inborn in us through, being raised with a family. We have a attachment to that family, and that family is part of a larger city or community that's part of a larger community still, right? So these ever-expanding social spheres, if you will, give us naturally a sort of attachment and pride in what we were raised with and what we experienced. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing unnatural about that. In fact, it's very much natural. But what's important to understand in this regard is that those at the top, those who have, if you will, gone down the rabbit hole to the extent that they've understood the ability of something like patriotism or tribalism to be manipulated, know that that force, what's perceived to be patriotic, can be marshaled and channeled just as much as the energy towards revolution can be marshaled and channeled. You see, so in other words, what I'm getting at here is that from the perspective of those at the top, and what we call full spectrum dominance, the left, with its tendencies of revolution, so-called anti-war activism, etc., 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 that sort of Marxist tendency of marshaling the proletariat against the capitalist and the capitalist-owned system is just as easily manipulable as is the so-called conservative right-wing traditional perspective, wherein you believe that patriotism is something that is one of the highest callings for you, if you will, right? So now, again, none of that is necessarily wrong, per se. Now, I think obviously that Marxism is more wrong, but what I'm getting at is that we've moved into a situation where the world that we live in is not what we think it is. So, patriotism is this force that oftentimes drives people to, go into something like the military, because they feel that they need to fight for America and to do good and so forth and so on, and that's all an instinctual, positive attitude to have. And likewise with people who are sort of what we might call bleeding heart or liberal, blah, 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 their concern is for humanity, so forth and so on. So they see the cause as, something where minorities and people are oppressed, so forth, so on, and so we'll have this, leftist, revolutionary, socialist cause that will fix things. What I'm trying to tell you is that all of these are fake. The patriotism is manipulated just as much as the left is manipulated. How and why is that? Well, because, like I was saying with the social engineers, or say the Rockefellers or something like that, families that have researched all these different modes and approaches to ruling, what they've actually found out is that these structures of power, these structures of rule, and I'm including communism and the left in that, because that's just simply another type of ideology. It's another type of worldview. These are all sort of piecemeal images or pictures of the world that can easily be run and controlled for the purpose of bringing about the desires of someone else, say at the top. Well, why would I say that? Well, if you look at the military and American patriotism, classically the left has said that American interventionism is the empire. It's an imperial approach. And so the empire sought to, check Russia in the great game of the last 100 years. And then it, sought to bring down China through opium. And so for most of the left, the idea is that, the empire ultimately is the bad guy, and it has to be stopped in any way possible, because that's really the source of all evil in the world, is the American empire. Is that true or is it false? Well, that's the whole point of this podcast, is that it's not really a question of these things being true or false, because as with everything in this life, there's a sense in which that's true and a sense in which it's not true. We have bases in over 100 countries, right? The American empire. We do black ops in all these different countries. We overthrow governments and we install new dictators, and then we throw them out and install a new one, and this cycle continues. So, on the face of it, that's correct. That is what we do. But what's the solution? Well, the left solution, classically, has been in some way to side with some kind of socialism or some kind of, quote, democracy, or some sort of, there's a myriad of different, what we might call leftist views. Communism, socialism, democracy, democratic capitalism, social democracy, you just go on and on and on. The problem with all these solutions, again, is that these are prepackaged solutions that are already long established tools of certain power structures. So, if we look at the history of revolutions, what actually emerges is that certain powers marshaled those revolutions against other powers, right? So even though you might have a whole tribe of people or a whole nation state that were maybe the majority believed the revolution was legitimate, something like the Arab Spring, in actual fact, that was a larger power block, a larger entity. In this case, the Arab Spring largely engineered through Google and Western intelligence. That was used to stir up the Middle East, establish new regimes, more amenable to the West, and not necessarily even the West, but globalist interests, if you will, international, corporate and international socialist interests. Those two powers, if you will, international corporatism and international socialism, are really just essentially different terms for the same modus operandi. It's just a command and control structure of on an international level, one based around supposedly corporate, private interests, the other based supposedly around government, public, collective interests. But of course, neither of that is true, because they're really just mafia. And that's the best way to understand it, is understanding mafias. Is it public? Is it private? For Republicans, for business owners, the perception is that government is the source of all evil. For the left, for those in government, the perception is that private corporations are the source of all evil. Well, the reality is, our system is a revolving door where people go from corporations to government to corporations to government. And so international corporations like Monsanto are able to lobby to have laws passed that favor Monsanto production on an international scale. Companies like GE can lobby to have laws passed through the Obama administration that shut down competition. So that's not a free market capitalist system where greed is what's driving all the problems on the face of the earth. That's the leftist perspective. Similarly, collectivism, government collectivism, and socialism can't entirely be the source of all evil on the face of the globe. For one, because those are new forms of power structures, if you will, that didn't exist in the ancient world. I mean, there was evil in the ancient world, and there wasn't essentially modern socialism, right? So socialism is not the source of all evil, contrary to Ayn Rand. And neither is free market capitalism the source of all evil, contrary to Vladimir Lenin and Karl Marx. These are just simply names or titles given to a certain power structure. So, in other words, you could take Coke or take some international corporation, strip away the logos, and tack on a bunch of different terms and different posters, and you would have an international socialist party. Because the structure of the party doesn't essentially differ much from the structure of a corporation. And that's, of course, the big secret. That's the big trick that no one is able to figure out, apparently. Well, not many people. So am I saying by this that all power structures are inherently evil? No, of course not. I mean, it would be completely unrealistic. There are always going to be power structures in the world. There's always going to be a hierarchy of some kind. And so essentially what revolutionary movements are tools of emerging power structures that would like to see a regime change in the present power structure. Or they could be tools of the present power structure used to disintegrate and divide and conquer an emerging threat power structure. And that's really what sums it all up. I mean, that's what's going on in the Middle East. That's what that's how the world works. It's basically an international mafia. And there's really no better way to understand it. And when you're an international mafia, it doesn't matter what the ideology is, because the ideology is simply the maintenance of the system itself, right? It's not a commitment to socialism. It's not a commitment to capitalism. It's not a commitment to any of these things. It's not a commitment to government regulation versus deregulation. I mean, all of these things are just simply attack patterns, if you will, that can be used in different situations. And the best way to understand all this is to just simply think about it on the local level. I mean, just imagine your local, let's say you lived in a small town. Just imagine the small town has a prominent businessman who runs most of the city, and he's tight buddies with the mayor or the whoever. And the mayor and the prominent businessman get together. I mean, one of them represents the collective, public sector, the mayor. The other one represents the, top of the pyramid of the private sector, the industrialist, whoever. And they get together and they decide to make some laws that will benefit them both. I mean, it really is that simple. That's what goes on in Washington. The lobbying from private interests buys off the congressmen, the senators, and laws get passed that benefit both parties. So it really doesn't have anything to do with whether government good, business bad, or business good, government bad. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't talk about the relationship between public and private sector. You could. I mean, that's a big, important issue. But what I'm getting at is that the way the world really works is just, it's far beyond that, because international corporations, a handful of them, owned by a few big mega banks, already own most of everything, including the governments. And that's why you see the same patterns of economic philosophy at work in most countries. Most countries have a central bank that prints what we call fiat currency. Now, why would that be? I mean, if we live in a world where there's organic development and things just sort of happen, like most people think, there's no connection between all these events per se, why would it be the case that almost every nation is run by a central bank that's private, that prints fiat currency? Why would that be? Is it just because everybody kind of figured out that maybe that's the best way that it works? Or is it that international central banks owned by private stockholders run all of these national central banks, and that it's essentially a scam? Well, if it was the best system, then we wouldn't necessarily have constant boom-bust cycles and numerous countries that have gone bankrupt through outrageous central bank money printing, through hyperinflation. But there are plenty of examples of those. So clearly, it doesn't really have anything to do with the fact that it just organically developed that people believe this is the best system. No, not at all. It actually has to do with the fact that powerful players have for a long time engineered to have that system put in place in most of the countries of the world. So what is the outcome of that? What does that mean? Well, that means basically that what we call nation states, or what we think of as nations, from this perspective, don't really exist. I mean, the real nation states, if you will, are the Tyrell Corporation and the Umbrella Corporation, right? Kraft and Boeing and so forth, right? Because these entities are international, and their income, their gross domestic product, is often larger than the GDP of actual nation states. So when you have a large corporation like that that's able to influence a smaller state, it becomes apparent that something like that is far more powerful than, you know, the local elected official that you sent, you know, from your state to Washington. Now that doesn't mean that the large international corporation is necessarily inherently evil. No, it doesn't mean that at all. In fact, I mean, the free market, the capitalist argument is 100% correct that capitalist nations that allow markets, have produced tremendous amounts of wealth and prosperity, and have had the highest living standard for the poor. So from the vantage point of the left and Marxists who want to try to fix things, if you will, by ending competition through markets, I mean, that's just completely unrealistic. It's not true. It's 100% bogus. And in fact, what Marxism actually is, as I've been saying, what revolutionary movements are simply tools of different powerful interests. This is why Marxism, socialism, all the leftist movements have almost always been supported by billionaire, trillionaire, multinational corporations, right? Multinational banks. Wall Street funds the Bolshevik Revolution. Wall Street funds Hitler. You see? Why? Because socialist revolutionary movements, and you can include National Socialism in that too, are tools for larger interests to get something done in a certain area for a given means or for a certain end. With the case of World War I and World War II, these entities were, these conflicts were engineered for the purpose of establishing, after World War I, the League of Nations, and following the League of Nations, World War II established the United Nations, the goal of which was eventually the convergence of East and West. Since following World War II, we had the Cold War. We had a similar situation where powerful international players that had already been running things for the previous century, or even further, then funded a large covert war between, quote, East and West that eventually led to is leading to the convergence. The convergence is really just the meshing, if you will, of the worst parts of socialism and the worst parts of capitalism. So when capitalism from the Enlightenment era gives rise to monopoly capitalism with the East India Company and British imperial interests, the dialectical opposite that arises is supposedly communism, revolution, proletariat, seeking to throw off all tradition and hierarchy, bring in egalitarianism. That becomes the dialectical opposition to the so-called traditional right, identified then with private property, capitalism, so forth and so on. So what emerges is a dialectic, and that's the whole point of all this, is that the philosophy undergirding this from a pragmatic perspective is Hegelian. Because Hegel had the idea that through thesis, I propose a proposition, you counter me with an antithesis, you argue against me, and it was just sort of a fundamental law of the universe that what will emerge out of this is the synthesis, like the merging of the two in a higher truth. So it's a constant sort of pyramid building on itself, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it keeps going. And so Hegel read this into all reality, and for him the whole world was this outworking of a big metaphysical triad that was constantly moving towards what he saw as a sort of eventual metaphysical, what he called the convergence, or what others have called the omega point, so forth and so on. Sort of a Neoplatonic type of view, if you will, where everything's going to merge back into the one, the great mind, so forth. Now, while social engineers, corporate heads, so forth, they may not have the metaphysical baggage behind all that they care about, but what they do find interesting and useful in that view is that there does appear to be a sense in which you can manipulate groups or entities through dialectics. And dialectics is something that's, of course, central to Marxism. But that's this idea that we can have proposition, antithesis, outcome, right? Problem, reaction, solution is the term given in, quote, conspiracy circles to this same idea. So if we want more funding, say, for some security state, we engineer an attack. The populace is then motivated to fund. We come with the solution, more security state. It's a very basic ancient tactic of warfare, right? So it doesn't have to necessarily be this big metaphysical jibber-jabber thing of all these Hegelian terms. It can be viewed as just simply a tool. Let's use the Hegelian dialectic, right, to bring about the convergence of the capitalist West with the socialist East. So it's a tool of rule, control, manipulation. It doesn't really have anything to do with, again, being committed to some ideology. Some people could be, some elites could be 100% committed to socialism. Some could be 100% committed to some esoteric Hegelianism. Again, that's not really the point. The point is that in the actual outworking of things in history, this tool is used to bring about a certain desired end. Thus, dialectics represent one of the main forms of control that are used to bring about desired ends. And so it's important then to understand that reality that you've been given, that you've been told is the case, that you've been raised with, most likely is not true. And the search for truth really, I think, is a defining character mark of those who, are willing to question. Because if you're not after truth, then the only other option is the self. And the self can't be the final arbiter and source of truth. This is, of course, the great lie that, all reality is just ultimately some manifestation of our own minds. It's sort of the ultimate form of narcissism, or solipsism, as it's called in philosophy. So really, the reorienting of one's view, first of all, centers around reorienting one's view of the source of truth, meaning, reality, existence, morals, and so forth and so on. Either of these things arise from the mind of the interior of the individual, or they are objective, existent, normative realities, states of being that are the case irregardless of our own existence. Now, that doesn't mean that when you come to be, when you exist, when you operate and function in the world, that you don't have an effect on the world, or that there isn't, that you don't participate in the meaning of the world. You do. The point is that you are not the source of it. So there's a radical reorienting of the individual's place in the universe, the notion of truth, the notion of what is, the notion of reality that comes about as a result of beginning to question and understand the world and existence and the great questions of philosophy, right? Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. So philosophy, philosophia, the love of wisdom, is in that sense a searching after those big questions. It's a searching after the meaning of our existence, the meaning of our own being, who we are. But the worldview that we are given is always, of course, in this life going to be piecemeal, because we don't possess omniscience. And ultimately, in the next life, it's progressively going to always be piecemeal, because we will never attain omniscience. That's not possible for the created being to attain. It's an attribute of the divine that is not communicable to something that by nature is and will always remain finite. Now, there's a sense in which the soul, in its interior life, possesses a kind of infinity, but that's still a created eternity or infinity. It's not something that possesses infinity or eternity by its own nature. But considering the issue of why I'm the way I am, I agree with Plato and with Socrates that really, and with Solomon in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, that really the unexamined life is not worth living, because it's essentially an animalian existence. It's nothing more than beastly existence. If we're not going to utilize our minds and our reason as the tools that they are, then we might as well just be animals. But the flight from reason and from truth and from aesthetics, from beauty, is not an easy flight. But of course, this is the course that most men take. They choose instead the course of deformity, the course of lies and deception, and the course of ugliness. Deformity as the negation of beauty, the deficiency, the lack of the good. And that of course is what evil is to choose that which is not good as opposed to that which is good. So when I began to learn these things in my own life, I decided that there is such a thing as truth. And since there is such a thing as truth, that's really all that matters. And there's no cost which should not be sacrificed for the sake of truth. Now, when I was 18 or 19 and I came to that conclusion, I was lacking in wisdom, perhaps, and about how I approached truth and gaining truth and so forth, and engaging others. So hopefully I've learned more tact in these 13, 14 years, but even still, the point still stands, the point remains that truth is really all that matters. And most people think that because there's a slight cost for the price of truth, and it may cost you something in the meantime, that it's not worth it, that the easy route, or what they think is the easy route, of something deceptive, some lie, some unexamined belief is going to bring them ease and comfort in the meantime. But that's not true. That is precisely the deception. Because as long as you believe some lie or have a set of beliefs that may be true, that are grounded on a more foundational lie, all that will do in the long run is hurt you. And let's say you've chosen some belief system. It's inevitable that you're going to live your life in accordance with whatever beliefs you have. Even if you say you have no beliefs, you're going to live your life as if you have no beliefs. That's unavoidable. It's something that's just obviously, by the very fact of the case, necessary. So, you're going to live the way that you believe. Your actions are necessarily going to reflect what your foundational beliefs are, even if you aren't aware of your foundational beliefs. It's just the world and we as humans are just structured in that way. Therefore, one can choose the path whereby life becomes meaningful, life becomes an adventure, it becomes its own sort of roller coaster where everything is meaningful, everything is significant, because it's all grounded ultimately in capital T truth, which I believe is God. Or one can choose to flee from that truth, from what's objective and what's good. But there's a price to pay for that too. So either way you're going to pay a price, inevitably. The price for that is you may attain some temporal benefit, some mediocre gain in the meantime. But it's a big risk, because if you're wrong, you're going to eventually, we don't even have to talk about the afterlife, you're going to waste your time and your life living out a meaningless existence because you had all along faulty beliefs. And it's not ultimately that you will succeed in making your existence meaningless, because every day, every time you speak a sentence, every time you see some object in the world, every time you interact with another human being, it is inherently the case. It is a testimony to your mind, to your conscience, that there is meaning in the world. And so your existence essentially becomes one of flight from meaning, flight from reality. But that's a long, hard road. There's no rest for the wicked, Isaiah says. So you're going to pay that way. And this isn't even necessarily all about some religious belief. I mean, this really applies across the board with anything. With any area of life in which you choose to believe deception, believe lies, it's only going to come back around and hurt you. As Deuteronomy says, be sure your sins will find you out. And the point is not being nitpicky about this or that little sin. The point is that every acquiescence to deception, every acceptance of what is false as true, in the long run damages you. So you're not getting away with anything. You're not getting ahead and one-upping everyone else by a bunch of deception. And I'm not that old, but I've lived long enough to see many people ruin their lives simply because they believe lies and chose to believe those lies. They chose to operate and live in such a fashion that was unwise. So, therefore, be sure your sins will find you out. But again, it doesn't even have to apply to a religious notion. This point, this is just sort of a basic common sense point of life wisdom, if you will, which sounds cheesy, but if you don't go the route that I choose, and I think this is why a lot of people don't like me, I sort of become a stumbling block or an example of someone who chose a different path. And that, of course, doesn't mean you have to do all the things that I do. But to choose to live such that none of your beliefs are questioned, you have no concern for what's true, it's to live an existence where you basically exist to negate yourself. Because there's an intimate connection between being and truth. What exists or what is also a necessary correlation to what's true. Because if something exists, then it is therefore true that it exists. So there's a metaphysical statement about a thing having existence. And there's also an epistemic statement, a statement of knowledge, that it is true that it exists. And knowledge and metaphysics and epistemology, the three branches of philosophy, can never be divorced. They can never be ultimately separated into schools or ways of thinking, modes of thinking that are divorced from one another. By the example that I just gave. I mean, if a thing exists, it is then true that it exists. So truth and being are intimately bound up together. Likewise, the opposite is also the case. Non-existence or non-being and lies or untruth are also intimately bound up together. If something is not true, then it is not the case. And you can also show philosophically that morals are intimately bound up with that too. If something is true, that also carries with it the assumption or the sort of necessary correlation that it is therefore good for a thing to be true and for a thing to have being or existence. And then therefore to have non-being or non-existence, or consequently to engage in deception and untruth, is therefore morally not good. So when we start with those sort of basic philosophical concepts, which may sound obtuse or sort of impractical, what we actually find is that life, existence, being, is therefore something objective, right? And if it's something objective, it's not determined by our own mental prowess, our own psychological processes. Our psyche does not cause the external world to exist like so many Eastern thinkers and New Agers and goofballs think. It is therefore a radical reorienting of one's view of things. And only in living in accordance with what is true can one find solace and meaning and therefore have a flourishing existence. Now, ultimately, those things I believe are grounded in God, but to begin to ask these questions is, of course, the first step. I mean, this kind of a view of the world is not just a beginning step view where you ask these questions and then move on once you think you have everything answered, because the outworking of these things is somewhat mysterious. Are they all answered? No. But is there objective truth? Yes. Does objective truth mean that you know all things? No, of course not. Impossible. Well, how could that be? That sounds like that's not possible. Well, it's a paradox. The paradox is not a contradiction.